It's late April of 2025, and I'm sitting in one of the saddest places I can think of in the Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts. Sad if you care about the native people that were here long ago. Because this spot, this flat area of ground here that extends to the other side of the river, is the first flat spot of ground below a series of cataracts on the mighty Westfield River, which is now dammed here in Warnoco. But this was a great gathering place for the native people, the Warnock and the Nonotuck, the Podunk, the Tungus, the Agawam, who knows how many others, came here and established fish weirs, fish traps on this river. They had fish traps below where I am too, but this was particularly good for them because the shad and the salmon would be tired by the time they got here. Or if they were coming back down the river, they'd be even more tired having spawned. So on the sides of the riverbank here, you can imagine a regular village, a fishing village filled with many different native people setting aside their differences to get the calories inside them because the starving time is over. And now the bounty of the earth is starting to show itself again. And the fish run is the first big bounty that the native people capitalize on. Out on the Cape, same thing's happening for herring and alewives on the small streams. Same thing's happening with shad and some salmon on the more minor rivers. But the Connecticut River Valley is all about those shad and salmon. And fishing was a huge deal here. If you lived along the coast, you could clam and mussel and harvest that way. Even a whale carcass might keep you busy if you got lucky enough to find one. But here, the native people gathered in these dispersed sites, and they came together, they fished. This is a special place. And 350 years ago was the last time that free people, all native people, First Nations, Indians, Native Americans, whatever you want to call them, this would be the last time that they would fish here and enjoy this river that I enjoy so much and have my entire life. It's now time to talk about the people that displaced them. In talking in my lectures to my students and to people online, I often hear the term "we" referring to the English colonies, the French colonies, the Dutch colonies. What the hell? We? They aren't us. They're completely different than us. They're a people that have been through a series of hundreds of years of wars, famines. They have lived in want. If you're a middle-class person in America today, you might want an electric bicycle, but you don't want the basic necessities of life. And if you were living in England or France or the Netherlands or Germany or any of those places that you know of on the map, you should also know that famine and starvation were your friends. That warring armies moving through your little kingdom would take all of your harvest and devour it, leaving you with nothing. This is an awful, awful time in history in Europe. This is why the New World was so outrageously wonderful to them when they discover it. Things they do aren't things you do in your civilized way of living. Or would you? If we take a look at a map of the New World in 1600, we can see that the English get in late and they're going to get the scraps that the other European powers haven't gotten to yet. The Spanish have had tremendous success in gold and silver rich and extremely fertile areas in South and Central America. The French have made their bones along the St. Lawrence Seaway in the extremely fur-rich environs there. Remember, fur-bearing animals bear better fur the colder the temperature. So the French colonies in the north, or New France, it was really just one colony, has far and away the best fur access. The Dutch are on the Great Hudson River with access to the Great Lakes. The Swedes are even in the game. The Portuguese are in Brazil. Pirate ships are moving up and down the coast. People talk about the Wild West. Well, this was the Wild West. We should call it the Wild Western Hemisphere. Everybody was in it for themselves, except for the people that you met in 1620 who came here to establish a communal settlement The idea being to found a religiously centered colony in Plymouth where they could live by their own lights, worship in their own way. They weren't about letting other people worship their way, however. Just ask all the strangers that were on the Mayflower, guys like John Oldham. The Pilgrims quickly made themselves obnoxious to them. And then there's the Puritans, a group of people who fled England because they could see the writing on the wall and they knew there was going to be a civil war. And there was. By 1642, the King of England and his Cavaliers are at war with the Puritans, the Roundheads, in a bloody and all-encompassing civil war that will ultimately cost him his head, but thousands and thousands of English their lives, and of course peasants their lives not with a quick sword cut, but with a long death by starvation or disease. So the world of England and the world of Europe were both not what you would call civilized. Just a quarter century after Columbus's first voyage, a new religion would be unleashed in Europe, a religion that claimed to purify Christianity from the centuries of dominance by the Roman Catholic Church. This would be Martin Luther's Protestant faith in all of its forms, because once you start deconstructing, it's kind of hard to stop. Both the Dutch and the English would be proponents of one variant or another of this Protestant faith. This Protestant faith, as it kept mutating, would lead to problems in both countries. And then, of course, we've got the Spanish, the French, the mighty Catholic monarchies, and a series of wars sweeping Europe that would lead to the ultimate conflagration that we call the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest wars in human history. A war that would involve all the colonizing powers, and many Englishmen that we are going to meet in King Philip's War had experience leading trained bands in the 30 Years' War or in the English Civil War, which went on at the same time. While there were many reasons for both these conflicts, the rank and file and the masses that supported them considered both conflicts to be religious in nature, with both sides basically crusading for their causes, whether it be for the Queen of Heaven or to sanctify and purify a religion that had been corrupted by centuries. Both sides could die the deaths of martyrs, with the King of England, Charles I, at the end of the First Civil War, becoming one of these martyrs at the hands of the winner, Oliver Cromwell, who would be forced, based on circumstances, to put the king himself on trial, condemn him to death, and have him beheaded, leaving the way paved for he himself to become Lord Protector of the fledgling English Commonwealth, and putting the Puritans and Pilgrims on the other side of the Atlantic in a position of unbelievable ascendancy. They who would come as refugees to the New World to worship freely and avoid a war, all of a sudden find that the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, shares their faith, the sense that they are destined by God for greatness, that their notion of a city on a hill has received divine recognition based on circumstances, will influence their demeanor, their decisions, and their relations with the native people for sure. And this is really the problem that Americans have always had in terms of understanding the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and that is their unbelievable faith, their notion that they were elect, that they were destined to sit in heaven and hear the choir of angels, I suppose. I don't know if they believed in angels. Point is, what people do we meet in history that are as religious as these Puritans who considered themselves modern children of Israel? Their belief that religion should be a day-to-day affair governing every aspect of their life from the time of birth is a reality that they lived with, and that if you want to understand them, you have to get a grip on. In this very patriarchal world, the father
or husband was the spiritual leader of the household, but he bent his will to the spiritual interpretations of the community's ministers. And communities struggled long and hard to find good ministers. In fact, the reason why divinity schools like Harvard and Yale are created here in the Northeast is to train ministers, because each town wants the very best interpretation of Scripture. These ministers would show up randomly and regularly at community homes and invite themselves to dinner and share in the interpretation of Scripture at the supper table. The world of the Puritans was strict and strongly religious, and they were not tolerant. Quakers or anyone that had different opinions of religion would be banished or executed, like Miss Dyer here, who is pictured being led to her execution on Boston Common. Any Puritan who had spiritual differences with his minister, like William Pension, might find himself banished, sent back to England. Now, these are the people that our native people will find themselves confronting. And when these Puritans and Pilgrims get their feet on the ground, they will be a force to be reckoned with. Arrogant, self-assured, and convinced of their own right to dominion. These Pilgrims and Puritans became very difficult neighbors. As we see with their actions in their own families and communities, they're often in feuds over religious dogma as handed down by a particular minister. Imagine what it must have been like when native men or women went out to work on Sundays, women in the fields and men to go fishing or hunting, and all of a sudden being confronted by angry Puritans accusing them of breaking the Sabbath. Wow. Next time, we're going to take a look at the various English colonies of southern New England and how these colonies developed on the eve of King Philip's War. See you then.